Amara Wilson stood at the edge of the train platform, her gloved hands clutching the handle of a modest travel trunk, her heart pounding beneath layers of carefully chosen lace and hope. This was supposed to be her fresh start. A life far from the narrow eyes of the city and the sharp sting of silent judgment. For 6 months, she'd exchanged letters with Harold Pierce, a 45-year-old widower who called himself a man of principle, longing for companionship. But now, face to face, everything crumbled. Harold looked as though he'd seen a ghost. His complexion went pale, his eyes wide in disbelief. This isn't going to work," he muttered. "You didn't mention that you were." His words trailed off, trembling in the heavy afternoon air. "Black?" Amara asked, her voice even, finishing the sentence he couldn't. Harold swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. The bouquet in his hand, a handful of limp daisies, drooped like his cowardice, petals slowly falling one by one. Amara's heart sank, but her spine remained straight. The hat she had picked out with such care now felt like a cruel joke. 3 weeks of travel, countless train transfers, and every last coin she had saved, all spent chasing a promise that vanished the moment he saw the color of her skin. "In your letters, you wrote so well," Harold stammered, stepping backward. I pictured something else. Couldn't you have warned me?" "Warned you?" she repeated, eyes steady. "That my skin is dark but my feelings are real? That I laugh, cry, dream, and hurt the same way you do? You never asked." Around them, murmurs started to rise. Passengers, station staff, and townsfolk began to steal glances. In Riverbrook, a well-dressed black woman being rejected by a white man was nothing short of a public spectacle. "You have to understand," Harold whispered urgently, clearly panicking. "My position here, my business, the community, it's complicated." He looked around like he wanted to disappear. "I'll pay for your ticket back. I never meant to hurt you, but I didn't expect this." Amara stared at him. The man who had called her dear heart, and his salvation, in every letter now couldn't bear to look at her. The man who had painted himself as lonely and kind, full of yearning for connection, now shrank away as if she were a stain on his reputation. "I spent all I had to come here," she said, quietly but firmly. "I have nothing to return to." Harold fumbled in his pocket and pulled out some crumpled bills, pushing them toward her like a payoff. "This should cover a room somewhere. Just until you figure things out." But before Amara could speak, a voice cut through the tension like thunder cracking across a clear sky. "Is that your answer, Pierce? Throw money at a woman and pretend your guilt doesn't exist?" A tall man stepped into view. His skin was weathered by the sun, his boots dusty, and his coat simple but unmistakably fine. The kind of understated wealth that didn't need to announce itself. His presence sucked the air out of the platform. Confident, powerful, unapologetic. "This is none of your concern, Maxwell," Harold snapped, but his voice betrayed his fear. "It becomes my concern when I see a man I've known for 15 years act like a coward," Alexander Maxwell replied, his eyes fixed on Harold with icy precision. He then turned to Amara, his voice softening. "Miss, my name is Alexander Maxwell. I own a property just outside of town. If I may, I'd like to offer you temporary lodging. My guest rooms are empty more often than not, and my housekeeper would be pleased to have someone to fuss over." Amara blinked, uncertain. Kindness from strangers had never come without conditions, not in her experience. "I understand your hesitation," Maxwell added quickly. "You owe me nothing. You're free to say no. But my offer is sincere." Harold's face turned red. "Maxwell, you can't be serious. What will people say?" Maxwell tilted his head, a cold smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You mean the same people who dine at my table, lease my land, and depend on my grain? The ones who smile to my face and nod in church? I'd love to hear what they'll say." Harold visibly deflated. In that moment, everyone watching understood. Alexander Maxwell wasn't just another man in Riverbrook. He was the man, the wealthiest landowner in the region, the person half the town worked for, directly or indirectly. He had power, and he had just used it to stand between Amara and humiliation. Amara looked at Maxwell, and for the first time since her train pulled into Riverbrook, she felt something close to safety. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. And as Harold slinked away into the crowd, Alexander gently took Amara's trunk and led her toward a carriage waiting nearby. What had begun as rejection was no longer an ending. It was just the start of something far more unexpected. No one at the Riverbrook station could have guessed that while Amara stood there, her pride bruised and her plans in disarray, she wasn't just carrying a trunk full of carefully packed clothes. Hidden among the fabric folds and leather-bound books was a secret. One so powerful it could shake the very foundations of that quiet, judgmental town. A secret that, if revealed, would make Harold Pierce regret the day he decided skin color determined a person's worth. If this story of quiet dignity rising above prejudice touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because what began as rejection would soon become a reckoning Riverbrook would never forget. The Maxwell estate was not merely a place outside town, as its owner had humbly described. It was a grand, Victorian mansion nestled among rolling pastures and rich farmland. Acres of corn swayed under golden sunlight, and purebred horses grazed with regal calm near an ornate wrought iron fence. As the carriage rolled past the massive gates, Amara sat in stunned silence, torn between admiration and unease. "People here aren't used to differences," Alexander explained, gesturing toward the house as it came into view. Riverbrook was built by traditional families who find comfort in the past. Harold Pierce is just a symptom of something deeper. They were greeted by Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper, a stern-looking woman with a neat bun and intelligent eyes. If she was surprised to see a black woman step out of Alexander Maxwell's carriage, she gave no indication. "I've prepared the blue room, the one with the garden view," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. The house was a gallery of elegance. Paintings of distant landscapes adorned the walls, and antique furnishings gave the space a quiet authority. Amara felt like she had stepped into a world that wasn't quite hers, but hadn't rejected her. At least not yet. That evening, seated beneath a gleaming chandelier in the mansion's formal dining room, Alexander shared his story. The son of a northern banker and an abolitionist schoolteacher, he had inherited not only wealth, but ideals. He had come to Riverbrook 15 years ago. Too rich to be shunned outright, but too different to be fully embraced. "And what about you, Miss Wilson?" he asked, eyes steady as he set his wine glass down. "Your letters must have truly impressed Harold for him to send a formal invitation." Amara hesitated, then nodded. "I was a teacher in Boston," she said. "I taught literature and history at a girls' school for young women of color. When the school closed due to lack of funding, I knew I had to find a new life." What she didn't say, what she hadn't told anyone, was the real reason behind those letters. Her grandfather, a man who spent his life as a butler for a wealthy family, had left her a small inheritance. Not just coins hidden in a velvet pouch, but old documents, legal and historical, that could challenge the very ownership of key lands in Riverbrook. Lands currently farmed, sold, and claimed by men like Harold Pierce. Those papers were hidden in a false bottom of her trunk, waiting. Over the next several days, Alexander gave Amara what few men ever offered her: space. The mansion's library became her sanctuary. Volumes on local law, geography, and land claims filled her days. She read for hours, charting boundaries and family names. And when curious visitors asked what she was studying, she simply smiled and said, "Broadening my horizons." But Riverbrook was a small town, and news of her presence spread quickly. People who hadn't stepped foot on Maxwell's estate in years now found urgent reasons to visit. Merchants' wives, church deacons, even the local reverend, all dropping in, all pretending to care about trivialities. Yet their glances drifted to Amara, every single time. "You've become quite the attraction," Alexander noted one afternoon, pouring her tea on the veranda. "And you haven't even left the house yet." Amara gave a wry smile. "I've always been an attraction, Mr. Maxwell. The only difference is that now, I'm holding a porcelain teacup while it happens." It was during one of those unsolicited visits that Harold Pierce returned. Hat in hand, suit a little too crisp, he arrived unannounced, face tight with false concern and thinly veiled regret. "Maxwell," he greeted, voice carefully neutral. "I just came by to see if Miss Wilson is comfortable." "Absolutely delighted," Alexander said, his voice flat, eyes sharp. "Why don't you ask her yourself?" Harold turned awkwardly toward Amara, managing a forced smile. Miss Wilson, I hope the accommodations are to your liking. Amara rose slowly, her gaze steady, unbothered. They're far more than I was promised in your letters, Mr. Pierce, she replied coolly. Something flickered in Harold's eyes, shame perhaps, or fear. What he didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that the woman he tried to dismiss was holding the very key to reshaping Riverbrook's future. And that clock had already started ticking. Harold's face paled the moment Amara entered the room. Gone was the exhausted, humiliated woman who had arrived at the station weeks earlier. In her place stood a vision of poise and quiet strength, draped in one of the elegant gowns Mrs. Foster had carefully altered for her. Amara moved with a regal confidence that unsettled the very man who had once dismissed her. Mr. Pierce, she said coolly, barely disguising the frost in her tone. What an unexpected surprise. Miss Wilson, Harold mumbled, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. I came because, well, the community is concerned about my well-being. How kind of them, Amara replied, voice calm and unreadable. Or is it really about my situation? Harold's eyes flicked toward Alexander. It's not proper, he began, for an unmarried woman to be staying in the house of an unmarried man, especially when she's black. Alexander finished for him, voice calm but laced with a dangerous undertone. Go ahead, Pierce. Please finish that sentence. Harold cleared his throat, struggling for words. The church committee is discussing options. We're collecting funds, thinking it best to help Miss Wilson return to Boston. Amara gave him a tight, practiced smile. How generous. Unfortunately, I have no intention of returning to Boston. I plan to remain in Riverbrook indefinitely. Harold's composure slipped. That's impossible. You don't know anyone here. You have no job, no family. I have a job, Amara replied unshaken. Mr. Maxwell has offered me the position of librarian at his estate. Apparently, the Maxwell family has collected more books than they know what to do with. It's time someone organized them properly. Harold blinked in disbelief. You can't be serious, he said, turning toward Alexander. I've never been more serious, Alexander said with a shrug. Miss Wilson is educated, capable, and more than qualified. My library has never been in better hands. But the position held far more meaning than Harold could comprehend. The Maxwell Library wasn't just a collection of classic literature. It held land deeds, historical charters, and records tracing the roots of every founding family in Riverbrook. Documents that revealed uncomfortable truths many would prefer stayed hidden. Harold's protests grew weaker, his voice shrill with disbelief. And when he finally stormed out, red-faced and flustered, Alexander watched him retreat across the garden with a smirk. He'll try to make your life difficult, Alexander said quietly. The blow you just dealt his ego won't be forgotten. Let him try, Amara answered, her voice steely with newfound purpose. While he spreads rumors, I'll be uncovering facts. Deep ones. The kind of facts he's never imagined. What Harold couldn't know, what no one in Riverbrook could possibly guess, was that Amara's hours in the library weren't simply spent cataloging dusty tomes. She had uncovered a buried history, that the so-called founding families of Riverbrook, including the Pierces, had built their legacies on land that was never lawfully theirs. And Amara had the documents to prove it. 2 weeks later, the small town hall of Riverbrook was bursting at the seams. An emergency meeting had been called. Founding family patriarchs, merchants, and landowners filled the room, abuzz with whispers. At the center stood Harold Pierce, gesturing furiously, his voice booming with rage. It's an outrage, he shouted. Maxwell is mocking our traditions, keeping that woman under his roof. Decent families are worried. Rumors are flying about inappropriate behavior. Murmurs of agreement filled the room like smoke thickening in a fire. Then, without warning, the heavy double doors creaked open. Alexander Maxwell stepped inside, calm and unbothered. Behind him walked Amara Wilson, poised and regal, her chin held high. She didn't flinch beneath the dozens of judgmental eyes now fixed on her. She didn't have to. Her presence demanded respect. A hush fell instantly. I appreciate the invitation, Alexander began, his deep voice resonating across the hall. Though I must correct a serious misunderstanding. Miss Wilson is not here as a guest. She is here as the legal representative for a matter that concerns every single person in this room. Harold gave a short, incredulous laugh. Legal representative? A woman of color with no title, no education, no authority? Maxwell, have you completely lost your mind? Amara set her leather briefcase on the table with deliberate grace and clicked it open. Actually, Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice steady and strong, I am more qualified than you realize. She reached inside and pulled out a thick bundle of aged documents, tied with a silk ribbon, deeds, maps, signed statements. Proof. Because unlike tradition, she continued, locking eyes with every man who had once dismissed her, truth doesn't care about color. And with that, the room held its breath. Riverbrook's reckoning had begun. In addition to being a certified teacher, Amara said, her voice unwavering, I also hold legal power of attorney as the direct descendant of Joseph Freeman. The name struck the room like a thunderclap. Silence fell. Faces blanched, eyes darted. Even Judge Thornton straightened in his seat, visibly shaken. That's impossible, Harold snapped, his voice too quick, too defensive. Joseph Freeman doesn't exist, he's an urban legend. Curious, Amara replied coolly, pulling a bundle of faded papers from her briefcase, because I have here the original deed, signed by the governor in 1866, granting Joseph Freeman, my great-grandfather and a man freed after the Civil War, legal ownership of the land that now makes up nearly 60% of Riverbrook. She laid the documents on the table in front of the judge, their yellowed edges delicate but legible. Including, I might add, she said, turning to Harold, the land your store currently occupies, Mr. Pierce. Gasps rippled through the room. Judge Thornton adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to examine the documents. This appears authentic, he murmured. It's a forgery. Harold barked, but the quiver in his voice betrayed him. The supporting evidence is extensive, Amara continued. I have here accounts detailing how Joseph Freeman was driven from this land under threat of lynching in 1870. His property was seized by a self-appointed Riverbrook Property Committee, the very families who now call themselves founders of this town. Alexander stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. The Maxwell Library has a full archive of regional land records. Oddly, the documents from 1870 to 1872 had long been missing, until Miss Wilson cross-referenced letters and transaction logs buried in unrelated files. Heads turned as Reverend Miller, the town's elder statesman, slowly stood. My father told me that story once, he said, eyes moist. Said it was a sin buried deep. Told me not to speak of it, but to remember it. I'm not here to punish the children for the crimes of their ancestors, Amara said firmly, sweeping her gaze across the stunned room. I'm proposing a solution. A community foundation, built from these reclaimed lands, that benefits everyone. Scholarships, public libraries, affordable housing, and cultural preservation. Harold let out a hollow laugh. You think anyone's going to fall for this? No one will believe it. At that moment, the side doors opened, and a tall man in a gray suit entered. The whispers stopped. Attorney Jeff Martin, Alexander introduced, legal counsel, licensed across 3 states. Jeff nodded to the judge and faced the room. The documents have been authenticated by the State Historical Records Commission. I'm here to confirm that a lawsuit has been filed with the regional court. All claims are legally binding. Riverbrook will answer to history. Chaos erupted, angry shouts, panicked murmurs, chairs scraping. Harold lunged toward Amara, his face twisted in fury. You planned this from the beginning, he spat. You hid this in your letters. You used me. Amara didn't flinch. No, Mr. Pierce. In my letters, I was just a lonely woman hoping for a fresh start. It was your rejection, the moment you saw my skin, that told me who you really were. The same kind of man who once judged my great-grandfather for the exact same reason. You're going to ruin us, Harold whispered, pale and trembling. No, Amara said softly, almost gently. I'm going to correct a wrong. And I'm going to do it in the fairest way possible, for everyone. That's the difference between us. I've lived through discrimination, yet I don't wish to take anyone's home, not even yours. As Harold collapsed into a chair, his face hollow with defeat, the city council requested a recess to deliberate. Alexander moved to Amara's side, admiration shining in his eyes. "You could have demanded everything," he said quietly. "And become just like them?" she replied. "Justice isn't revenge, Alexander. It's restoration." What no one in that room could foresee was that Amara Wilson, the woman they had mocked, rejected, and underestimated, would become the architect of Riverbrook's rebirth. The legacy she would leave behind wouldn't be one of lawsuits or ownership, but of dignity, education, and vision. 6 months later, Riverbrook looked nothing like it once had. The Freeman Foundation, seeded with restitution funds and private donations, was thriving. Scholarships flowed to underprivileged youth. A new community library opened where a forgotten factory once stood. Affordable housing rose near the church. And people, black, white, and everything in between, came together at town meetings that no longer ended in shouting matches, but in shared purpose. At the heart of it all stood Amara, not as a conqueror, but as a builder, a teacher, a reminder that true power comes not from what you take, but from what you give back. And while Harold Pierce faded into obscurity, Amara Wilson and Alexander Maxwell shared a quiet moment in the garden, the scent of jasmine in the air. Their eyes met, not just with the warmth of allies, but with the promise of something deeper, a future not written by bloodlines, but by character. And for Riverbrook, that changed everything. Amara Wilson stood on the porch of what was once the Maxwell estate, now reborn as the Freeman Cultural Center. The laughter of children echoed across the grounds that had once belonged solely to the elite, now open to all. What had begun as an act of rejection had bloomed into a movement. Riverbrook had changed, and so had its people. Ironically, the very store Harold Pierce once prided himself on now served as Riverbrook's first public library. A place where suppressed histories, like that of Joseph Freeman, could finally be told. Harold had vanished just weeks after the legal revelation. He sold his properties for pennies on the dollar and disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of bitterness and shame. Rumor had it he was working as a store clerk in a neighboring town, his pride as diminished as his fortune. "You could have destroyed him completely," Alexander said one crisp autumn afternoon as they walked the gardens. Part of the estate now featured murals, exhibits, and open spaces, symbols of a new beginning. Amara watched a group of local schoolchildren play tag on the lawn. "Revenge would have satisfied me for a day," she replied. "But this," she gestured around them, "this will bring us fulfillment for generations." News of the Freeman case had spread far beyond Riverbrook. Journalists, historians, and civil rights advocates visited the town, eager to learn how a long-buried injustice had been unearthed and reconciled through grace instead of vengeance. Amara became a sought-after speaker, lecturing at universities and legal conferences. Her approach, leveraging historical documents, community outreach, and unwavering dignity, became a case study in restorative justice. When Alexander and Amara married in a quiet, joyful ceremony, the Maxwell mansion was renamed the Freeman Maxwell House. During the celebratory dinner, Judge Thornton stood to make a toast. "To the woman who reminded us that justice is not just about the law. It's about how we live it every day," he said, voice thick with emotion. "When Amara first came to Riverbrook, we judged her by what we saw, not who she was. Thank God she saw more in us than we saw in her." Beside him, Martha Webb, now principal of Riverbrook's new inclusive community school, raised her glass. "And to think it all started with a cruel moment at a train station." Alexander leaned in and whispered to Amara with a wry smile, "Harold's best decision was rejecting you." Amara chuckled, though I doubt he'd agree. In the heart of the town, where once only the founding families were celebrated, a modest bronze plaque had been installed. It didn't depict a hero in stone but told the simple, powerful story of Joseph Freeman, how his land was stolen, and how, more than a century later, justice was finally restored. As night fell and stars glittered above, Amara stood once more on her porch, tea in hand, watching the town she had transformed. She had arrived as a rejected stranger, an educated black woman dismissed as unworthy. Now she was a pillar of the community, not for assimilating, but for standing tall in her own truth. Alexander joined her with a second cup. "You know what's ironic?" Amara said quietly. "Harold couldn't picture a life with someone who didn't fit his mold. In the end, that's what destroyed him. And I thrived," Alexander added, because I welcomed exactly what he feared. Your strength, your story, your truth. The lesson Riverbrook learned was simple but profound. When we judge others by their appearance, we not only diminish their humanity, we rob ourselves of the value they could bring into our lives. Amara didn't win by tearing Harold down. She won by lifting others up, by reclaiming dignity without sacrificing compassion. As the moon rose above the hills and the town lights shimmered below, Amara knew the real victory wasn't in the lawsuit or the headlines. It was in the library filled with children's voices, in the classroom where every student felt seen, in the community built on justice instead of prejudice. And perhaps most powerfully, it was in the fact that Harold Pierce's rejection was now just a footnote in the much larger story that Amara Wilson wrote with wisdom, grace, and unshakable purpose. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of justice, dignity, and the kind of strength that doesn't destroy, but rebuilds. Peace.